is going to be another computer vision and image processing based demo. I love the previous one. I think this idea of like thinking of image processing in an agentic way is actually quite interesting. So that's what my talk is going to be about. I'm talking about ML Blocks, which is a project I've been working on, sort of on the side. A little bit about me and sort of how ML Blocks came to be. Basically, my company, Dabble, we work with e-commerce brands doing synthetic photography. So sort of generative AI, we use a network of 3D artists generating high-quality 3D renders for home brands, things like that. And we were not very happy with this manual process, and we wanted to kind of scale it up and improve our margins and things like that. So we found that we had to start building a lot of small image processing microservices. And my background is in computer vision. And so one of the interesting things about what's happened in the last couple of years is there's been a ton of really interesting vision models that can do really interesting things. And there's really easy places to host them, like Replicate and things like that. However, like when you think about actually using hosted inference for multimodal, like vision, it's not as easy as just calling a model remotely and running your JavaScript app. Often the biggest hurdle to multimodal processing or image processing is the pipeline code that you have to write, where you have to, the interesting thing about LangChain is you can chain together multiple models. And you take your text, you process it, and your front end, you pass it on to the next model and do some of the things. But when it comes to vision, you often have to run really complex processing code in the middle, like Gaussian blurring or convolution or Fourier transform, anything like that in a lot of cases you need GPUs to run the non-AI stuff as well as a lot of expertise in computer vision and a place to run OpenCV. And so what we wanted to do was not mission critical, we just wanted to quickly host a vision microservice in the cloud, and that just became a really hard thing to do. And so what we figured is there has to be a way, like Zapier, to quickly host advanced computer vision workflows for various workflow-related image processing tasks that you can just build a quick workflow, whether you're an e-commerce company or a real estate company, or anyone that needs image processing, let's say logistics, host it in the cloud as an API and then call it in your front end, whether you're a web developer or a mobile developer, right? Or whether you're using a no-code tool like Airtable, a retool, things like that. So I'll quickly go over sort of what I'm talking about. I spoke about the motivation ML blocks, and I'll show you a couple of demos. So here's the app. It's mlblocks.com. I'll go over this. I'll show you a couple of demos, and then I'll just peek into the code a little bit. So essentially, like I said, it's a no-code way to build AI-driven image processing workflows and automations. So you can see an example here. I've got an input image. I remove the background. I crop out all the transparent pixels. I resize the canvas and add a color background. Right? So I'll show you how to build a simple workflow. So we'll build a new workflow here. And what opens up is basically this canvas that lets you add, there's two concepts, right? There's canvas and then there's blocks. And if you look on the left, basically what I've done is I've added a bunch of different image processing blocks that are just like cards that you can drag into the canvas, right? So one of them you can see probably relevant to the previous demo is generative AI models like generative painting, multimodal LLM, basically GPT-4 vision, depth prediction, which is depth anything, control net, et cetera, et cetera. And then a bunch of editing blocks like rectangle crop, change the brightness, things you might expect on Photoshop but don't really exist as specific APIs. What's interesting is, there's a bunch of these use cases, like in real estate, it's very common to take a real estate image and enhance the sky. And there's literally thousands of people on Upwork that just offer sky enhancement of images because no one's going to build a very specific app just for that. And so there's a lot of these like little specific workflows that are related to computer vision that would never exist or never be relevant as a specific company or a startup or a product, but are really relevant to a lot of kind of old school businesses. So here's a quick starting point. I literally am going to show you how to invert an image. So I just drag an image in and I just hit play. Right? So that's going to go and start that workflow. And let's see whether it does something. and that will start. There you go. Okay. So this is really simple, right? I just wanted to invert colors. So now let's look at a more realistic use case, right? So say I'm an e-commerce company, and I want to automatically process my e-commerce images, right? I start off with something like this, graph. I want to remove the background, so that's an AI block. That's using essentially dichotomous segmentation for people who know. I crop out the alpha pixels. I want to now take this image and turn it into a mobile form factor, right? I want to turn it into a portrait mode image with a height of 1600 and a width of 900, and I want to add a yellow color background. Let's say I'll just pick another color, and I'll just play on that.
So what model have you selected?
What's that?
What model have you selected?
So the remove background is just the dichotomous image segmentation model. There's other services as well, so some blocks here actually connect to just a marketplace of services like remove VG or I think stability as a clip drop and things like that. But this one is, I'm just hosting it on Multimodal. It's just the open source DIS model from Hugging Face. So there you go, right? So essentially what happened here is I took this image, I removed the background, and I essentially changed the canvas size, right? This is something people manually do in image editing tools like Photoshop, Canva, Figma, that kind of thing. But often there's so much repetitive work here that we found that it's just easier to set up a quick dashboard and run this, whenever you need to. And then you can go even fancier, right? The interesting thing about doing this in workflows is it doesn't have to be just one single process like Zapier. You can go very crazy. I mean, let's say you are now a Shopify store and you want to take some input images and turn that into one transparent background cutout, one thing with a shadow, another image with like the cup standing on a table with white flowers or whatever, and do that for every different form factor, mobile, Shopify, Amazon, etc., etc. There's a lot of images per SKU that you have to generate. And so here, I mean, I've actually pre-run this one, but you can see the graph basically generates, you can essentially generate as many outputs from as many inputs as you want, right? So here's the run history. And you see a bunch of images that have been generated, and this is just to show you guys sort of the mask that's output from the remove VG. So I take this image, I add a transparent background, and I basically add a color background and a generative in-painted background with a wooden table and white flowers. Am I close to it? Okay. Okay. So what's interesting now is that this is cool. You can run this one at a time. But it becomes even more interesting if you call it as an API. And so essentially, once you build out a workflow, it's instantly hosted on this graph ID. You can pull up your API key and regenerate a curl command. And essentially, if you call that curl command, you can essentially automate it. So I can send in one input because that's what the graph expects, and receive a variety of outputs per run. And an example of that is I just ran this, I don't know if you guys know, you've used Airtable in the past, but basically it's like it's Excel, but you can run JavaScript in Excel, right? So you can automate things. So I have this, I'm just kind of pretending like I'm this e-commerce company, I've got a bunch of products, and I want to generate images for Instagram, Amazon, and Shopify. And so I can go through, build out an automation to run it, and call your graph, and you can generate all of these images in a fairly automated way. So I won't go through the whole code because I'm running out of time, but you guys can talk to me later and I'll show you. I'll show you a couple of quick, cool examples. Let's say you want to blur faces in an image. So what does that involve, right? You want to actually select faces, and you want to add a blur mechanism on top of it. So there's a really cool model that lets you select things with a prompt, and it's called grounding Dino. And so I have a grounding Dino running on a block that I call prompted segmentation. I segment out the faces, I run a blur, and you get an output like this. And then, let's say you want to add depth of field, like fake depth of field, circa Lightro camera. You take an image like this, you pass it through depth anything. Essentially, you start off with a depth map, and these depth maps are getting insane. And then You pass that again to a prompted segmentation to say, select a face, and then assume that's the focal point, and blur everything based on the depth map. Right? Okay, and basically, and one last piece is, let's say you're an e-commerce company, you have a bunch of images like this, and you want to generate images of the same product in a different scene. You would basically segment out the sofa, so you'll see it picks out just that sofa, and then it generates a new scene that includes that sofa, but has a bunch of other stuff around it. Right? That looks exactly like the original one. It's a bit cartoony, I don't know why that happened, but hey, it's always an experimentation. Yeah, so that's basically ML blocks.
Nice.
You guys have any other questions? Feel free.
I like it.
Yeah.
I really like that we can see the cost at the right bottom.
Yeah.
I wonder like where you guys host this, run this models.
Good question. So here, I'll show you quickly what the architecture looks like. So basically, the architecture is that the front end is a library called React Flow that lets you create really cool flow diagrams. We have a orchestration backend that basically takes that graph and then runs it, orchestrates it and runs each model. You'll see a lot of parallels to like Comfy UI if you've played around with Comfy UI. The thing about Comfy UI is the whole workflow is then hosted on a single server, and so it tends to be not very scalable in production. So what we did is every individual component is auto-scalable. So the orchestrator sits on a scalable server, and then every block is essentially an external API. Right, so we host every block as a separate microservice. So for example, remove BG is on Modal running a dichotomous segmentation. Remove the generative in paint is actually just running on Replicate. We're calling the generative in paint model on Replicate. And then the costs suggest if you have a graph with like 4 AI blocks, you just sum the cost of each that we're paying for each of these plus some of it. That's basically it. Yeah. Yes.
What model did you use to blur the faces?
So selecting the face was grounding Dino, which is essentially a combination of Dino and segment anything. So Dino basically lets you select a bounding box around the prompt, like a face, and then given that bounding box, you pass that into segment anything, and it will pick out what it thinks is like the most relevant thing. So segment anything is this model by Facebook that does the segmentation.